The idea that the British taxpayer should pay reparations for the slave trade is utter nonsense. Labour MP Clive Lewis is calling for us to send money to the Caribbean to say sorry for the slave trade. In fact, he thinks we won't be able to move forward as a nation until we do so.
Already now I can hear the howls of those opposed to reparations and apology, which no British government has ever given. Go to the Caribbean and what you will see is the past alive and well today.
Well, this is just the latest example of lefty woke word salad from people who want Britain to hate itself. Nobody alive today should have to apologise for something that happened hundreds of years ago. Look, for a start, reparations have already been paid. Between 1807 and 1860, the Royal Navy West Africa Squadron seized approximately 1,600 ships involved in the slave trade and freed 150,000 Africans who were aboard these vessels. I think actively stopping the slave trade is a pretty good way of making amends for it. I mean, how far back do we go with this stuff? Maybe we could fund reparations by claiming a few of our own, from the Vikings, the Romans, or the Ottomans. Around 1.25 million European Christians were enslaved in the Barbary slave trade, but we're not going to get any money for that. So it would have to be ordinary people living in Britain today who would pay. But how would that work? We couldn't make everybody pay, because if we did, that would include the descendants of slaves, so we'd have to trace everyone's family tree back and exclude anybody who is related to somebody who was brought to Britain against their will. Or we should probably exclude any immigrant then, really, shouldn't we? Because there's no way that they could be blamed for Britain's historical wrongs. OK, so it's just white people then, is it? Well, what, people like me? I mean, I'm half Greek, Cypriot and half Irish, so what am I paying for? My ancestors were probably just peasants. It's not a shock, really, is it? All right, so it'll have to just be white people whose families we can trace back to having lived here hundreds of years ago when the slave trade was going on. But actually, now I think about it, that poses a bit of a problem as well, because most of those people lived and worked in appalling conditions. And don't just take my word for it. Earlier, I had a chat with this chap.
So if the British taxpayer is going to pay them, you will have the vast majority of British people who are descended from factory workers, farm workers, etc., whose conditions were very little better than slaves. In fact, in some cases, worse.
OK, so not those people then. It's getting a bit ridiculous at this point, I think, isn't it? And then, of course, there is the question of whether or not it's the people living in the Caribbean today who should really be getting the reparations. I mean, are their lives today seriously negatively impacted as a result of the historic slave trade? Here's another chap I spoke to a bit earlier on.
Cold hard facts from Mr. Lewis are that the descendants of slaves living in the Caribbean have a far better quality of life than they would have had if their ancestors had remained in Africa. Because Britain's Caribbean possessions, unlike West Africa where the slaves come from, are now middle-income countries. So the Bahamas has a GDP per head which is comparable to Spain and Italy, and it's higher than Portugal.
So, after we've tracked down maybe the few hundred people alive in Britain today who it could just about be claimed might owe some debt as a result of the slave trade, Clive Lewis MP would then want them to send money to the wrong place. Now, Mr Lewis was, of course, bang in favour of us staying in the European Union, which many regard as a protectionist racket that predominantly serves the majority white population of continental Europe and puts barriers on trade with Caribbean and African nations. So, when people say that British taxpayers should pay financial compensation for the slave trade, actually, they are talking utter rubbish.